Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at the Mad Titan himself, Thanos, which is back in the meta in a big way, not only in PvE, but also in PvP with the latest uniform and with the changes to the seasonal uniform that he previously had, the Farmer or Harvester uniform. Because I already tested Thanos at tier 4 last year with his seasonal uniform, in this video I'm mostly just going to be focusing on the difference between his latest uniform and the seasonal uniform to see how much of an improvement the PvE version or the seasonal uniform is compared to the PvP one, and to basically determine whether you even need the PvE uniform if the newer one is pretty much just as good. As a spoiler, the newer one isn't just as good. The seasonal uniform or the PvE one is drastically better than the PvP version or the Thanos Wins uniform, i.e. the latest one. And you'll see that soon enough in the testing that I do. And keep in mind that all the clips that you'll see are without a damage proc. I have a brilliant CTP of Conquest on Thanos, and that is what I use to test him in both PvE and PvP. The first thing that I did was to take him into a stage 35 of Kang using his own leadership and 2 supports, and again without a damage proc, and it needed to be a high enough stage where the character couldn't complete it very quickly at tier 4, otherwise I wouldn't be able to gauge exactly how much of an improvement the seasonal uniform is in PvE compared to the latest PvP uniform. I was actually quite surprised that I was able to clear stage 35 with the seasonal uniform, because I don't think I really came close last time I tried with this, but all the improvements they did to the hit count made a pretty massive difference, as I was able to clear it with well over a minute left. The latest uniform, Thanos Wins, is much slower than the seasonal uniform in PvE, and the previous seasonal uniform has a drastic advantage over the latest one. You can see that in this particular clip at the 1 minute and 13 second point where I pretty much finished the fight with the seasonal uniform. I still had well over 20 health bars left with the latest PvP uniform. In fact, with his most recent uniform, I wasn't even able to complete stage 35 and ran out of time with 8 health bars left. There's 3 main factors why the latest uniform doesn't perform as well as the seasonal uniform in PvE. The first is that he doesn't have damage accumulation anymore. He previously had it on the 5th skill, but doesn't have it on the latest uniform. The second is that he doesn't have iframe ignore on his finishing move. With the seasonal uniform, he previously had an iframe ignore on the 4th skill. This worked really well because you would guarantee that you would finish on that skill and that all of your attacks would hit the boss because they couldn't dodge it by going into iframes. With the latest uniform, you don't have that. The boss can potentially interrupt your rotation by just going into iframe, even though you finish your rotation with the 5th skill, which doesn't have iframe ignore. And the final factor is that he just has less hits on the latest uniform, whereas the previous seasonal uniform not only had more hits before, but was buffed to have even more hits now. Although I think Thanos is a major threat in PvP now with his latest uniform, not the seasonal one, if you do want to build him for PvE and leverage the seasonal uniform, then you definitely can do that. A CTP of Rage would likely be your most ideal option. However, he is very proc friendly with the seasonal uniform or the older one, so you could definitely use something like a CTP of Energy or even a CTP of Destruction if you wanted to. You can see just how powerful Thanos is in PvE with that upgraded seasonal uniform now, as I was pretty much able to solo Dormammu in almost 2 minutes flat without a damage proc. I can't even do that with some tier 4 characters with a damage proc, so it shows you just how powerful he is. As for his rotation, you simply do 5, cancel 3, cancel 4, and when you have your ultimate available, you use that and delay cancel it when you see the black hole starting to appear in his hand, and then you do the same rotation of 5, cancel 3, cancel 4. The rotation for his latest uniform is completely different, but it is also very proc friendly. You do 3, cancel 4, cancel 5, and again, once you have your ultimate, you delay cancel it and do the same rotation afterwards. 3, cancel 4, cancel 5. If you don't have the seasonal uniform for Thanos, I wouldn't really recommend building him for PvE. You could use the same build if you have both uniforms. However, for the PvP uniform and for him to excel in PvP at a high level, you kind of need a survival based CTP and not a proc based one. Again, you can see the drastic difference between the two uniforms, as the latest one is almost a full minute slower than his previous seasonal uniform. A similar result can be seen in Alliance Battle. With the latest uniform, I was able to score around 11.5 million in ABX, which actually isn't too bad, but with the seasonal uniform, I was able to score almost 1.5 million higher, which is a drastic difference, and again, that is because of all those extra hits and the damage accumulation on the 5th skill. Thanos does have all of the cancel effects for the various seasons in ABX and ABL, however I don't think that he is meta for Alliance Battle Legend because Loki just outperforms him. That doesn't mean that Thanos can't be used for that. He is very strong for it, especially if you build him for ABL with a CTP of Rage, but again, I think that if you play Loki well enough, he does exceed Thanos' score. You can see that even without a damage proc, I was almost able to score 6 million. I kind of screwed up the rotation a little bit, so I'm pretty sure that he can score past 6 million without a damage proc on my account. That means that if I was to use something like a Mighty Rage, he should easily be able to score around the 8 million mark or even higher. So far, I've only really painted the seasonal uniform as the one to get because it performs just so well in PvE, but you can see that in PvP, it's pretty much the complete reverse. The seasonal uniform really struggles with the latest metas, whereas the latest uniform actually has become the new meta. I don't really have to thoroughly test the seasonal uniform to show that it does struggle in PvP with the latest metas, and that he struggles to stay alive and usually hovers at very low health or is just sticking around out of iframes because he's waiting for his iframe ignore to come off cooldown on that 4th skill. This is the key difference with the new uniform, with the main change centered around the 1st skill. The 1st skill now has the iframe ignore, super guard break, and the 80% penetration to all sources that the 4th skill previously had. However, the main difference is that with it being on the 1st skill, the cooldown is much shorter, 8 seconds, which is 4 seconds if you have max cooldown, as opposed to the 13 seconds going down to around 6 or 7 seconds if you had max cooldown. This means that Thanos won't ever really just stand around waiting for the opponent to come out of iframe, since he'll mostly have access to the iframe ignore in his rotation, whether you play him on manual or on auto. He does lose the invincible that the 4th skill previously had, that's now moved to the 5th skill. However, the 1st skill now has a partial iframe, which in my opinion is much better because you can use the partial iframe to chain other iframe skills and basically act like you're in full iframes by chaining one skill to the next, whereas with the previous skill you were just left there kind of attacking in place and the opponent easily could just target you and kill you while you're doing your 4th skill. One of the added effects to the 1st skill is the removal of all debuffs for 2 seconds, which is quite good because it keeps the character from being locked down or crowd controlled, since he's constantly cleansing any of those negative effects by using the 1st skill. The only downside of this is that this effect is pretty much equivalent to the debuff leadership, and with it being only 2 seconds, if the debuff leadership is active at the same time that you use the 1st skill, it will overwrite it. So if you had, let's say, 7 or 8 seconds of a debuff removal effect on the character and then you activate the 1st skill, it'll immediately go down to the 2-second duration as opposed to finishing off the 7 or 8 seconds and then the additional 2 seconds. This can at times backfire if you get crowd controlled in that gap between those debuff removal effects of the 1st skill or the debuff leaderships, and it's not entirely clear whether this interaction should be like this. It does work like this also for Spider-Man and Adam Warlock that have a similar effect. However, theirs lasts for 5 seconds or somewhere around there, so you don't really notice it as much. But for Thanos, it being 2 seconds, you kind of notice the times when he doesn't have that active because it doesn't last too long. This is kind of a necessary vulnerability considering just how strong the character is and how powerful his kit is. As you can see, he is easily dismantling tier 4 characters with multiple lives and immortality with just his single life. But this vulnerability isn't even necessarily a weakness for Thanos because his 5th skill actually has debuff immunity for 5 seconds on it. And fortunately the AI's rotation goes from the 1st skill to the 5th skill, so it not only removes any active debuffs on the character, any crowd controls, but then also provides him with debuff immunity. The first skill also has a 25% heal on it, which is massive for a skill that is on such a short cooldown and that can be used at any time, even when the opponent is in iframe. You can essentially just keep spamming heals for the character if he's low health, on top of the other heals that he gets when he gets hit. It's also worth noting that the super armor that he previously had on his fourth skill, the iframe ignore skill on the old uniform, is now in his passive, which means that the character is always active with that super armor and is more resistant to guard break skills. And one of the most important changes is that he now gets his remove all buff effect back in his kit. It previously was remove all active buffs, which means that it would remove all the buffs that you see in the top near the character that had numbers on them. But now, with it being all buffs, he can remove all the ones that are basically loaded in with the character, which is a huge buff for the character because he can strip some massive buffs like the uniform, passives, and things like that from the character and just leave them with pretty much no stats at all. His first skill in some ways acts like the Molecule Man leadership, stripping some very strong buffs away from the opponent. However, if the character has 2 lives and has those buffs removed and then ends up dying, on the revive they should be able to get all of them back. If you look at the top right corner for the opponent's buffs, you can see that when Thanos uses his first skill, he not only removes the buffs that have numbers on them, so active buffs, but also the ones that are static or fixed. You can see a lot of them disappeared as soon as the first skill connected, which also includes things like support passives. And if that wasn't enough, the first skill has very high skill priority, meaning that it will basically be used before other character skills. And you can see an example of that compared to Adam Warlock's second skill. But on top of that, the first skill also repositions the character behind the opponent, meaning that if the opponent uses their skill after the first skill has been used, the targeting will basically not hit the character. And you can see an example of that right here. Thanos opens with his first skill when Adam Warlock used his second skill, and he just avoids all of the damage from that second skill. He can basically survive the one shot that Adam Warlock does. This is another one of the major reasons why the character is so much better with this uniform, since he isn't locked down in one place doing his damage, and his damage is done in a quick 1-second burst as opposed to just sitting there and attacking. The funny part is that most of the clips you saw of him dominating meta characters weren't even with proper supports. I basically just had Thanos on the team with his own leadership and just some health supports, but if I add in some actual proper supports that increase his damage and damage reduction, like Colossus and Shuri for example, he becomes just insanely tanky and the burst damage just goes through the roof. In terms of his build options for PvP, you can kind of get away with using anything, but the most ideal ones will still be the ones that make him tankier or add to his survival, because you want to leverage that one life as much as possible in a meta where there's characters with multiple lives, either through revive or immortality, and because his offense is already really strong and gets even better if you allow him to rotate through his skills so that he gets those debuff cleanses, immunity, and is able to strip buffs from the opponent as well as do more damage by layering skills on top of one another. Because of this, the top CTPs that I would recommend for him are a CTP of Conquest and Authority, followed by a Refinement and Regen. You can actually leverage those CTPs now, the Refinement and Regen, because he spams his first skill that provides those extra heals. It won't necessarily perform as well as the Conquest and Authority, because the Conquest also provides him with Reflect Immunity, which is one of his weaknesses in a meta where Silver Surfer is present in a lot of fights. You kind of want that Reflect Immunity, and you also kind of get a perfect balance with the character because you get that extra added survival when you always combo him with supports, and he deals a massive amount of damage when that top proc is active. Similarly, following the Conquest CTP is the CTP of Authority. With that Steel proc, you can basically combo it with the 55% damage reduction to get either to the max or close to it if you have a Mighty, which essentially makes him immortal for those 5 seconds that effect is up. And considering how tanky he is already, and you get that extra damage on top of the tankiness when that effect is up, just makes him a major threat. Refinement and Regen follow those CTPs because Refinement doesn't give him guard break immunity, which, like I mentioned, if he is between those gaps where he's using that debuff removal effect and gets hit, he can basically be locked down by normal skills regardless of the fact that he has super armor. But you can definitely make it work, and then regen would basically follow after that because it gives him the guard break immunity, but you're also kind of dependent on that top rock activating to interrupt the opponent. And for both of these CTPs, you don't really get the offensive benefit that you would get from Conquest and from Authority. There's also something worth noting that the refinement and the regen also help versus opponents that have reflect because he doesn't have as much offensive capabilities. So that's just something to consider if you don't have other CTPs. Not only is the character dominant on auto and is basically the meta in timeline now, but if you choose to use him on manual, he is even stronger. You can spam a lot of his skills now because they are on short cooldown, and they all provide you with useful effects such as partial iframes, full iframes, super guard break, and a lot of layers of damage and other additional buffs like the remove debuffs and things like that. If you're playing Thanos on manual, his ideal rotation is to open with the first skill. This will give you that iframe ignore to hit the opponent. It'll also strip their effects from the character, will also heal you from any initial burst, and lock them down with super guard break, not to mention cleansing you of any debuffs. From there, you want to go into the fifth skill, which provides you with invincible, that debuff immunity. It locks down the opponent with super guard break, adds a lot of AoE damage on the field, and it also ignores the opponent's damage reduction to a degree. You cancel the fifth skill into the fourth skill because it is a full iframe skill, so you can avoid a lot of attacks from the opponent. They'll just be standing around while the AoE layer from the fifth skill and the fourth skill is active. And if the opponent has reflect, you can avoid any reflect by hiding in that iframe. If the opponent still isn't dead at this point, you can use the third skill that will basically add another layer of damage as well as super guard break, and you can go into the second skill, which is a partial iframe, to again avoid any kind of reflect damage or just to keep the opponent locked in place because they don't have their iframe ignore up. If they still aren't dead at this point because they've activated a CTP effect or have procced something, you can just go into the first skill to strip that away, and all of that damage will pretty much instantly one-shot them on top of the first skill damage. Because Thanos is going to be predominant in timeline, you need to know ways to counter him. So some of the ways I found is to basically swap into another character after taking that initial first hit. So you either tank the first hit or just lose a life from a character that has 2 lives. Then you swap to another character or use that same character to burst down Thanos. So for example, you can swap to Emma after Jean takes the first hits. Usually when he'll use his fifth skill is when you can do a lot of reflect damage with Surfer or with Emma. Otherwise, you can just use the second life of Jean to do damage by doing the full rotation, or using Surfer to do the 4 and 3 combo for the reflect. Or as you saw in the last clip, you can switch to Spider-Man after the first hit or the first life of Surfer and use his fourth skill. Besides the character being meta in timeline, he is also a major threat in Alliance Conquest, since a lot of times you can combo him with supports. Considering that he has his own debuff leadership, you can make him super tanky with that CTP of Conquest, which synergizes really well with supports, and he'll be able to burst down pretty much every meta in the game. There's only a few characters that can hard counter him, which I'll cover in a sec, but as you can see from these clips, he can basically take out any meta team now and has ascended to basically the very top of the meta for Alliance Conquest as one of the very top teams that can offensively take out any opponents. Thanos is actually very troublesome to deal with, again because of that first skill, which is being the most powerful in the game now. He can move around, take off buffs, just cleanse himself from debuffs and all things like that, and does huge burst damage at the start. You can see things that should basically counter him, like Surfer with the Reflect, or even Molecule Man to remove some of his buffs, aren't necessarily a guaranteed counter to him. From the testing that I did versus him, Carnage was a decent counter to him by using Agent Venom and a CTP of Greed build to ignore some of the damage reduction from his supports and from a possible CTP of Authority build. Again, you can use Molecule Man with Adam Warlock and Wolverine. Adam Warlock will provide some potential burst to take out his life or trigger these effects, and then Wolverine should be able to clean him up. But again, this isn't guaranteed since the burst damage from Thanos will also trigger Wolverine's artifact and probably kill Adam Warlock pretty quickly too. One of the better counter teams that I found versus Thanos is to use Silver Surfer for the reflect damage, as well as a burst character like Black Widow, for example, because she can actually reposition to avoid Thanos' first skill. In the third position, I used another reflect character to be able to get Thanos' health down fast enough past the middle point or before his procs start to get going, so that Black Widow can either one-shot him or the proc from Widow can lower him down enough for the reflect to get him. His best counter by far is to use Ghost Rider with supports. That insane burst damage that he has will absolutely one-shot Thanos, and funny enough, or ironically enough, it might actually be better to combo Thanos with Molecule Man now, so other characters can't use supports to counter him, which would also shut off Ghost Rider's insane damage buff that he gets with his iframe ignore. But for now, I would highly recommend saving Ghost Rider to counter Thanos teams, since he is the most consistent one versus him. These last tests don't affect the majority of people, but it is worth noting I have been playing in Alliance Tournament in the top team, Nemesis, and one of the tests I did was to run Thanos with Surfer and Adam Warlock to see how he would compete versus the long reigning champion team of Jean, Colossus, and Adam Warlock. Surprisingly enough, Thanos never died once in all the tests that I did in the various different rounds, and I never lost once on offense or defense. The character is just insanely tanky and very strong offensively, that he can basically deal with the top team in this game mode. The fact that he doesn't instantly die and can handle some of these top builds from various players in the game just showcases how much of an improvement this new uniform provides him. As you can see from the various clips and the breakdown that I did, the Thanos Wins uniform is a major upgrade for the character and essentially puts him back in the top 3 meta for timeline and in the very top meta for things like Alliance Conquest and possibly even Alliance Tournament. I didn't really cover Thanos' performance in Otherworld Battle because I feel that that is one of the modes that he doesn't really perform that well in. You usually want characters that have multiple lives or have the immortality effect so they can build up to the tier 4 skill. But for Thanos, him having 1 life, he kind of does struggle there since he can spawn into just a massive amount of damage and die right away, and has to basically really work to get up to that tier 4 skill. One of the other downsides of him in this mode is that his most important attack, the first skill, can end up missing because it is kind of a linear attack. It's not really an AoE kind of attack. So depending on how the opponents are configured or scattered around the map, it can just end up not really doing too much. For that reason, and because he can just die pretty easily with 1 life, I wouldn't really recommend him for that mode. However, if you do use him for that, a CTP of Authority does end up being the best option for him specifically for that mode to avoid damage, and the Conquest ends up struggling by a decent amount compared to it. Regardless of this, the character is pretty much dominant in all other PvP modes and has set a new kind of precedence for characters that have 1 life actually being able to be in the meta now, where again it is dominated usually by characters that have 2 lives from revive or immortality. So it introduces a pretty interesting kind of precedence for the future, as more characters can potentially just be super stacked and be able to be in the meta for PvP without that immortality or revive. That is pretty much the breakdown for Thanos' latest PvP uniform and the upgrades to his seasonal uniform. If you are considering tier 4ing the character, you would get a lot of value from getting both uniforms. However, if you just want to use him for PvE or PvP, then just get the respective uniform that excels for that. I put a lot of effort and testing into this one, so if you did enjoy the video, found it entertaining or useful, please consider liking, subscribing, and possibly sharing it with others, since it can help them out too, and it obviously helps my channel grow. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. I'll do my best to respond. And as always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch these videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.